A lonely widow adopted a dying dog, unaware its collar held the key to her lost family treasure. Margaret Haynes stood at her living room window, watching raindrops race down the glass like the tears she'd stopped allowing herself to shed. 3 years since Robert's passing, and the silence in their Victorian home had become a living thing, breathing, expanding, filling every corner with its emptiness. Outside, November winds stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oak tree Robert had planted when they first moved in 40 years ago. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her thin frame. At 68, she felt ancient, her body a collection of aches that served as constant reminders of all she'd lost. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times. The sound echoed through the house, bouncing off walls adorned with photographs of happier times, wedding pictures, family vacations, their daughter Emily's graduation. Emily lived in Australia now, with video calls and occasional visits the only bridge across the distance. The last call had ended with the same gentle suggestion. "Mom, have you thought more about selling the house? It's too big for just one person." Margaret's fingers traced the cold window pane. She couldn't explain, even to herself, why she clung to this house when its memories sometimes felt like ghosts haunting her. The missing family heirloom was part of it, the antique locket containing a miniature portrait of her great-grandmother, passed down through generations of women in her family. It had disappeared shortly after Robert's funeral, along with several other precious keepsakes from the mahogany jewelry box he'd made for her on their 10th anniversary. The loss felt like another death, the severing of a tangible connection to her ancestors, to the stories her mother had told her as she'd placed the locket around Margaret's neck on her wedding day. "One day you'll pass this to Emily," her mother had said, a promise Margaret could no longer keep. With a sigh, she turned from the window and picked up her shopping list from the kitchen counter. The refrigerator held little more than condiments and a half-empty carton of milk. She had to venture out, even if the thought of navigating the cheerful bustle of the grocery store made her stomach tighten. 30 minutes later, Margaret hurried from the store, paper bags clutched against her chest, shoulders hunched against the rain that had intensified. The parking lot had filled while she shopped, forcing her to park at its farthest edge. Head down, she didn't notice the small shape huddled against her car tire until she was nearly upon it. A dog, thin, wet, and trembling, looked up at her with rheumy eyes. Its matted fur, once perhaps a golden color, now hung in dirty clumps. Around its neck was a worn leather collar cracked with age. "Oh," Margaret whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Where did you come from?" The dog made no move to run or approach, just watched her with those sorrowful eyes that seemed to hold a universe of pain. Margaret set her groceries on the ground and slowly crouched, her knees protesting. "Are you lost?" Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, gentler than it had been in years. When she extended her hand, the dog flinched. Margaret recognized that instinct, the bracing for hurt that never quite leaves after you've experienced enough of it. The rain plastered her silver hair to her scalp as she remained still, hand outstretched, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the dog inched forward and sniffed her fingers. Up close, Margaret could see it was an older dog, perhaps a golden retriever mix, male, with gray around his muzzle and a scar across his nose. His ribs pressed against dull fur, and he moved with the careful deliberation of an animal in pain. "No tags," she murmured, examining the collar. "Just worn leather with a small, tarnished brass buckle." Margaret hadn't planned on taking him home. She told herself she would just drive him to the animal shelter. But as she lifted him into her car, surprised at how light he was, something shifted inside her chest, like a door long rusted shut beginning to creak open. "Just until we find where you belong," she told him as she arranged her jacket beneath him on the passenger seat. The dog settled with a deep sigh, his eyes never leaving her face. At home, Margaret's well-ordered routine shattered in the face of immediate needs. She found an old towel to dry the dog, then a bowl for water, which he lapped at desperately. A quick search through her refrigerator yielded leftover chicken from 2 nights before, which she warmed slightly before offering it to him. "You need a name," she said as he ate with careful, measured bites. "Just until we find your family." The dog paused and looked at her, his tail giving a single tentative wag. "Chance," she decided, the name coming to her unbidden, "because that's what we're both taking here." That night, Margaret made a bed for Chance in the laundry room, using old blankets arranged in a box. But at 3 in the morning, she woke to the sound of whimpering. Following the noise downstairs, she found him trembling, caught in what appeared to be a nightmare. "It's all right," she murmured, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now." His eyes opened, confusion giving way to recognition. When Margaret returned to bed, Chance followed, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. She hesitated at her bedroom door, then sighed. "Just for tonight," she told him, patting the foot of her bed. It took him 3 painful attempts to climb up, and when he finally settled with a groan, Margaret felt tears prick her eyes for the first time in months. In the gray light of morning, Margaret studied Chance as he slept. The rain had washed away some of the dirt, revealing patches of golden fur interspersed with white. His breathing seemed labored and he flinched in his sleep. The veterinarian's office was busy when they arrived, filled with healthy puppies and kittens that made Chance seem even more fragile by comparison. Dr. Reeves, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and efficient hands, examined him thoroughly. "He's approximately 12 years old," she explained, her fingers gently probing Chance's abdomen. "Malnourished, dehydrated, and I'm concerned about this mass I'm feeling. We'll need to run some tests." Margaret nodded, her hand automatically moving to Chance's head. "Will he be okay, Doctor?" Reeves's pause told Margaret everything before she spoke. "We'll do everything we can, but he's an older dog who's clearly been through a lot. There's evidence of old injuries that never properly healed, and if this mass is what I suspect..." She trailed off, then met Margaret's eyes directly. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Haynes. We're likely looking at palliative care." The words hit Margaret with unexpected force. "How long?" "If it's cancer, as I suspect, perhaps a few months, maybe less." Margaret looked down at Chance, who gazed back at her with complete trust. Something shifted in her chest, a resolve forming where moments before there had been only uncertainty. "What do we need to do to make him comfortable?" On the drive home, Chance's head rested on Margaret's lap as she steered with one hand. The prescription medications rattled in their bag on the passenger seat. "Cancer, advanced stage. 3 to 6 months, doctor," Reeves had said. The words echoed in Margaret's mind as she stroked Chance's head. "We'll make the most of it," she promised him. That evening, after Chance had taken his medication and eaten a small meal of the special food doctor Reeves had recommended, Margaret sat on the floor beside him, examining his collar more closely. The leather was cracked but good quality, and something about the worn brass buckle seemed vaguely familiar. As her fingers explored its surface, she felt a slight irregularity on the underside. Turning it over carefully, so as not to disturb Chance, she noticed what appeared to be a small compartment built into the back of the buckle. With trembling fingers, Margaret worked at the tiny catch. It resisted, stiff with age and neglect, but finally gave way. Inside was a tightly folded piece of yellowed paper. Puzzled, she carefully extracted and unfolded it. The handwriting struck her first. The elegant, slanted script she would recognize anywhere. Robert's handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. The locket and other pieces are safe where no one but you could find them. Remember our first anniversary? That's where our treasures wait. I couldn't bear the thought of Emily selling these pieces of our history after I'm gone. Forgive my secrecy. I love you always, Robert." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her vision blurring with tears. She read the note 3 times, her mind racing. Their first anniversary, they had rented a cabin in the mountains, a small place with a stone fireplace and a hidden compartment beneath the hearth where previous owners had once stored valuables during Prohibition. But how had this note ended up in a dog's collar? A dog she'd found by chance in a parking lot miles from home? Looking down at Chance, who had fallen asleep beside her, Margaret whispered, "Who are you? How did you find me?" Sleep eluded Margaret that night, her mind filled with questions. The cabin had been sold years ago to a young couple. Had Robert somehow hidden their family treasures there before his death? And how had this note found its way to her via a stray dog's collar? Morning brought no answers but a new determination. After ensuring Chance was comfortable with fresh water, his medication, and a soft bed in the living room, Margaret made 2 phone calls. The first to Emily, explaining she needed to take a short trip and would call her in a few days. The second to the real estate office that had handled the sale of the cabin. "Yes, the Pinecrest property," she confirmed. "I was wondering if you could tell me who purchased it after we sold it." The receptionist hesitated. "I'm not sure I can give out that information, Mrs. Haynes, please," Margaret said, her voice catching. "It's important. My husband may have left something there, something precious to our family." Perhaps it was the emotion in her voice, or perhaps just human kindness, but the receptionist relented. "The Hendersons bought it from you, but they sold it again about a year ago. It's been vacant since then. The new owner is renovating it as a vacation rental. Margaret's heart raced. Do you have contact information for the new owner? 2 days later, Margaret found herself driving up the winding mountain road, Chance securely settled in the passenger seat with a blanket and his favorite toy, a squeaky duck she'd purchased on impulse. The new owner, a Mr. Collins, had been surprisingly accommodating when she'd explained the situation. Renovations haven't reached the main fireplace yet, he'd told her. You're welcome to look around. I'll be there myself overseeing some of the work. As she navigated the familiar curves, memories washed over her. Robert singing along to the radio, their hands linked over the gear shift, the excitement of their first anniversary getaway. Beside her, Chance whined softly, as if sensing her emotional turbulence. We're almost there, she assured him, not entirely sure if she was speaking to the dog or to herself. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, its wooden exterior weathered by years of mountain seasons. Mr. Collins, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and paint-spattered jeans, greeted her in the gravel driveway. Mrs. Haynes? I hope you found the place all right. Margaret nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by being here again. Thank you for allowing this. I know it must seem strange. His kind smile reminded her of Robert. Not at all. My wife and I were married 43 years before I lost her. I understand how important keepsakes can be. With Chance on a leash beside her, Margaret entered the cabin. The interior had been partially gutted, with new drywall in some areas and exposed beams in others. But the stone fireplace remained untouched, dominating the far wall just as she remembered. Take all the time you need, Mr. Collins said, gesturing toward the fireplace. I'll be outside if you need anything. Alone with Chance in the echoing space, Margaret approached the fireplace slowly. Her knees protested as she knelt on the hearth, her fingers seeking the hidden catch Robert had discovered all those years ago. For a moment, she feared renovations might have sealed it off, but then her fingertips found the slight depression in the mortar. With a soft click, a section of the stone hearth shifted. Margaret's heart pounded as she carefully moved the stone aside, revealing a dark space beneath. Chance whined beside her, his nose twitching with interest. Inside the cavity was a metal box, no larger than a hardcover book. With trembling hands, Margaret lifted it out and placed it on the hearth. It wasn't locked. When she raised the lid, tears immediately spilled down her cheeks. There, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay her family's locket, along with her grandmother's pearl earrings, her mother's wedding band, and several other pieces she had thought lost forever. Beneath them was another note in Robert's handwriting. For Emily, when she's ready to understand that some treasures can't be measured in dollars. A sob escaped Margaret's throat, years of grief and loneliness breaking free. Chance pressed against her side, his warmth a steady comfort as she cried for all she had lost and, somehow, found again. When she finally composed herself, Margaret closed the box and stood, wiping her eyes. Let's go home, Chance. The drive back passed in a blur of emotion and memory. Chance slept most of the way, the medication making him drowsy, while Margaret's mind filled with questions still unanswered. How had Robert's note found its way into the collar of a stray dog? How had that dog found her? Perhaps some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. In the weeks that followed, Margaret established a new routine centered around Chance's needs. Morning medication with breakfast, short walks when he felt strong enough, afternoons spent together in the garden when weather permitted or beside the fireplace when it didn't. She read to him from Robert's favorite books, telling herself it was for the company of her own voice, but finding comfort in Chance's attentive gaze. Emily called more frequently now, curious about this sudden change in her mother. "You sound different, Mom," she said during one call. More like you used to be." Margaret smiled, watching Chance doze in a patch of sunlight on the living room floor. "I feel different. I can't explain it, but finding that dog, it's like he found me, really. It changed something. And you found the locket," Emily added. "Dad's secret hiding place. That's incredible." "Yes," Margaret agreed, touching the locket where it now hung around her neck. "But it's more than that. It's like what, Mom?" Margaret struggled to find the words. "Like Chance reminded me that even when we're preparing for an ending, there's still life to be lived." As winter gave way to spring, Chance's good days became fewer. The medications could only do so much, and Margaret could see the effort it took for him to greet her each morning, his tail wagging despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Doctor?" Reeves made house calls now, checking on him weekly, her gentle hands and kind eyes providing both medical care and emotional support. "He's fighting to stay with you," she observed one afternoon as Chance dozed after his examination. "He's quite remarkable." Margaret nodded, her hand resting on his side, feeling each labored breath. "I've been wondering, is there any way to find out where he came from? Who might have owned him before?" "Doctor," Reeves considered this. He wasn't microchipped and the collar had no identification. "But we could try putting his photo in some of the lost pet databases, see if anyone recognizes him." 2 days later, Dr. Reeves called with unexpected news. "Mrs. Haynes, I think you should sit down for this." Margaret lowered herself onto the kitchen chair, her heart racing. "What is it? Did someone claim him?" "Not exactly, but I did find someone who recognized him. A woman named Caroline Wilson. She runs a small rescue for senior dogs about 30 miles from here." Margaret frowned, trying to make sense of this. "Does she know who owned him before?" "That's just it, Mrs. Haynes. According to Ms. Wilson, Chance, though she knew him as Charlie, belonged to a man named Robert Haynes. Your husband." The world seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. "That's impossible. Robert never had a dog. I would have known." "Doctor," Reeves's voice was gentle. "Ms. Wilson says Robert volunteered at her rescue after his retirement. He adopted Charlie Chance about 6 months before he passed away. Apparently he would visit with him a few times a week. But why wouldn't he tell me?" Margaret whispered, though even as she asked, she knew the answer. Her grief over her mother's recent death, her fear of loving anything else that could be lost, she had closed herself off, even from Robert, in those final years. "Ms. Wilson said Robert told her you weren't ready for a dog yet, but that someday you might be." After Robert died, Charlie disappeared from the rescue. They assumed he'd escaped, looking for Robert. They searched for months but never found him. Margaret's gaze drifted to the living room, where Chance lay sleeping in his bed near the window. "How did he find me? After all this time? Animals have ways we don't understand." "Doctor," Reeves said softly, "Ms. Wilson would like to meet with you if you're willing. She has some things Robert left with her." The rescue was a modest farmhouse surrounded by fenced yards and small outbuildings converted to comfortable spaces for elderly dogs. Caroline Wilson, a sturdy woman in her 60s with cropped gray hair and weathered hands, greeted Margaret with a firm handshake and knowing eyes. "He talked about you all the time," she said as she led Margaret to a small office at the back of the house. "Robert, said you were the love of his life, even when grief made you hard to reach." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. "I didn't know he came here." Caroline nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Grief does that, puts blinders on us." Robert understood. "That's why he came here, I think. These old dogs, they know about loss and pain, but they still have so much love to give. Like he did." She unlocked a filing cabinet and removed a manila envelope. "He left this, asked me to hold on to it. Said someday you might come looking if Charlie found you." With trembling hands, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a small photo album and another letter. The album contained pictures she'd never seen. Robert sitting among a group of elderly dogs, Robert with Charlie Chance, the two of them looking at the camera with identical expressions of contentment. The letter was dated 2 weeks before his heart attack. "My beloved Margaret, if you're reading this, then 2 things have happened. I'm gone, and Charlie has found his way to you. Don't ask me how I know he will. Some things defy explanation. You've been so lost in your grief over your mother that I couldn't find a way to reach you. I thought perhaps Charlie could do what I couldn't, when the time was right. He knows about loss too. His family surrendered him when they moved to a place that wouldn't allow pets. But he never stopped loving, never stopped hoping. I've hidden our family treasures where only you would think to look. Not because I don't trust Emily, but because I wanted you to be the one to decide when she's ready for them. They're not just valuable things, they're pieces of our story, our history. Charlie has been my companion these last months when you were here but not present. I've put a note in his collar that will lead you to the treasures if you're open to receiving it. If not, then perhaps these words will never reach you. I love you, Margaret. I have since the moment I saw you in that blue dress at Sarah's wedding, and I will love you beyond whatever lies after this life. Find your way back to joy. There's still time. Forever yours, Robert." Tears flowed freely down Margaret's cheeks as Caroline sat quietly, allowing her this moment of connection across the divide of death. When she finally looked up, Caroline offered a tissue and a gentle smile. "He believed Charlie would find you when you needed him most. Margaret wiped her eyes. But how? After 3 years? Caroline shrugged. Dogs have a sense we can't explain. Robert spent hours with Charlie, talking about you, showing him your picture. The note in his collar, that was Robert's idea. He said, if he ever finds her, she'll need to know where to look for what's been lost. On the drive home, Margaret glanced at Chance, Charlie, dozing in the passenger seat. You've been looking for me all this time, she whispered, carrying Robert's message. That night, Margaret sat on the floor beside Chance's bed, the photo album open on her lap. Why didn't I see what was happening? How he was trying to prepare to make sure I'd be okay. Chance lifted his head, resting it on her knee. His eyes, though clouded with age and illness, held a wisdom that transcended species. The next morning, Margaret called Emily. I'd like you to come visit, she said without preamble. There's someone I want you to meet, and things we need to talk about. Emily's surprise was evident in her silence before she answered. Mom, Australia to Pennsylvania is a long trip. Is everything okay? No, Margaret said honestly. But it will be. There are things your father left for you for both of us. And there's Chance. He doesn't have much time left, and I think your father would want you to meet him. 2 weeks later, Emily arrived, her face showing both jet lag and concern as Margaret greeted her at the airport. The drive home was filled with Emily's questions and Margaret's explanations about Chance, the locket, Robert's secret volunteer work. I don't understand, Emily said finally. Why wouldn't Dad tell you about any of this? Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. I think he tried in his way, but I wasn't listening then. I was too wrapped up in my own grief over losing my mother. At home, Chance greeted Emily with a gentle curiosity, his tail wagging weakly as he sniffed her offered hand. He looks so frail, Emily whispered. Doctor? Reeves says it won't be long now, Margaret acknowledged, the words still painful to speak aloud. But he found me. He completed the mission your father gave him. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, exhausted from travel, Margaret sat beside Chance on the floor near the fireplace. His breathing had become more labored, and he'd refused his dinner, accepting only water and a few gentle strokes along his side. Thank you, she whispered, pressing her face into his fur. For finding me. For bringing Robert's message. In the morning, Margaret knew even before she reached his bed. Chance had passed peacefully in the night, his body still warm but the spark of life gone from his eyes. She sat beside him for a long time, one hand resting on his still chest, tears falling silently. Emily found her there and knelt beside her, arms encircling her mother's shoulders. Together, they grieved for this dog who had carried a message across years and miles, guided by a love that defied explanation. They buried Chance in the backyard, beneath the oak tree Robert had planted. Emily helped Margaret create a small stone marker with a simple inscription, Chance, Charlie, messenger of love. As they stood beside the fresh grave, Emily took her mother's hand. What will you do now? Margaret touched the locket at her throat, feeling its weight, not a burden, but an anchor connecting her to all that had come before. Live, she said simply. That's what Robert wanted. What Chance showed me was still possible. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Emily sorted through the house together, not to prepare it for sale, but to rediscover its stories. Each object held memories, some bittersweet, others joyful, and Margaret found herself able to share them now, the words flowing where once there had been only silence. Emily extended her stay, working remotely from Robert's old study. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge in the twilight, she asked a question that had clearly been on her mind. Do you think it was really Dad's plan? That this dog would somehow find you years later, lead you to the locket, bring us back together like this? Margaret considered this, her fingers automatically touching the locket. I don't know, she admitted. It seems impossible. And yet it happened. A series of coincidences, Emily suggested. Perhaps, Margaret agreed. Or perhaps love creates connections we can't explain. When Emily finally returned to Australia, the goodbye at the airport was different from all those that had come before. There were tears, yes, but also plans. Emily would return for Christmas, and Margaret would visit Australia in the spring. I've been thinking, Emily said, hoisting her carry-on bag onto her shoulder. Maybe it's time I learned more about our family history. Those pieces Dad saved, they're my heritage too. Margaret smiled, touching the locket. When you come for Christmas, we'll go through everything together. I'll tell you all the stories. After Emily had passed through security, Margaret stood watching until she disappeared from view. Then, instead of the usual heaviness that followed these partings, she felt a curious lightness. Outside the airport, spring sunshine warmed her face. Margaret paused, closing her eyes and tilting her face toward the light. For the first time in years, the future didn't loom as an empty expanse to be endured, but as a landscape still holding possibilities. On the drive home, she took a detour, following signs to the local animal shelter. She had no intention of adopting another dog, not yet. But perhaps there was room in her life to volunteer, to sit with elderly animals who had love still to give, to be the connecting thread between what they needed and what she could offer. As she pulled into the shelter parking lot, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, the grief still visible in the lines around her eyes, but no longer the only story her face told. "Thank you, Robert," she whispered. "And thank you, Chance." She stepped out of the car into the sunshine, the locket warm against her skin, carrying with it the weight of the past and the promise of a future she was finally ready to embrace.